For many, 2021 is the year that they will finally be able to get their hands on Sony's newest gaming hardware, the PlayStation 5. Those of us lucky enough to have acquired one on launch have experienced the new hardware. With its excellent DualSense controller, its graphical abilities such as hardware ray tracing, they've shown what the future has in store for console gaming. June 2021 sees the release of Ratchet & Clank: A Rift Apart, a game that will hopefully display and demonstrate the power this new hardware has to offer. Something that has until now, in my opinion, only been demonstrated with the excellent Astro's Playroom, and maybe the 2 Spider-Man games. For many years, early adopters would always be able to see the power of their new machines on day one. Games would be released that, in some way at least, gave players something to demonstrate to their friends to give them bragging rights of their console's abilities. More often than not, this was a driving game. Commonly an arcade-style racer would be released alongside the main unit. Something that would give the console the ability to display fast, fluid movement connected to something that just about every player would be able to relate to. We've all seen cars on the road, even if we don't watch racing on TV. But these arcade racers have never really been the driving games that Sony machines have been associated with. Ridge Racer might be the title that started it all for Sony. But as for the non-Sony IP, their control over this is obviously limited. MotorStorm released alongside the PS3, in the UK at least, and for me it was the game that I had to purchase to see what my new machine was capable of. And very impressive it was, with fast-moving vehicles, ground deformation, large, detailed environments, and all the graphical excellence that I wanted to see why I'd spent the ridiculous £425. But it was not MotorStorm that I waited to see on this new hardware. For years, Gran Turismo had always been the driving game, and as such, it was the game to see what your PlayStation was capable of. Gran Turismo, by Polyphony Digital, has long been seen as the PlayStation driving experience. Gran Turismo has always been the title that driving fans have waited for. And wait they usually must. Gran Turismo 1 released in the West in May 1997, some 2 years after the release of the console. Of course, at this time no one really knew what an outstanding success and powerhouse of driving simulation Gran Turismo was set to be. Although I'm sure Yamamuchi-san and the team at Polyphony were very confident of this. Over the subsequent 24 years, 25 if you count from the original Japanese release, Gran Turismo has, in one form or another, landed a release on every PlayStation console bar one, the PlayStation Vita. But due to its ability to play digital only, admittedly, PSP games, even here the presence of Gran Turismo existed, albeit in a non-directly targeted version. Gran Turismo has many tracks that players have been able to enjoy over the years, but for me the one that stands out as Gran Turismo is of course Trial Mountain. With its sweeping corners, lit tunnels and foliage overhung straights, Trial Mountain for me really is Gran Turismo. It is the track that springs to mind when anyone mentions the game. It was the track that, for me, started it all. It was seeing Trial Mountain on Gran Turismo 3 on the PS2 that began my love of the series. I'm still not an accomplished Gran Turismo driver. I will never be able to move from digital racing to real-world racing, of that I'm certain. But Trial Mountain sold me on the franchise. At this time I hadn't much experience with console gaming, was new to the scene, having primarily been a PC gamer. The forthcoming release of Microsoft's Xbox had turned my head, but it was Sony that initially benefited from my head turning. By the time the Xbox had released, Gran Turismo 3 was out, looking, well, to me at the time, like nothing I'd ever seen. And off to my local store I went to buy a PlayStation 2 and a selection of games, including Gran Turismo 3, for less money than the Xbox alone was going to cost me. And I was hooked. Since then, I have searched for and bought each console and each version of Gran Turismo. Each has been played, not religiously, but enough. I'm ashamed to admit that I'm a rather fleeting gamer. For me, titles will be played until a new, shinier toy appears, where the previous best new thing gets slid onto the shelf to gather dust, until I eventually drag it back out, sometimes years later for a replay, only to realise that I played a ridiculously small amount of it on its first playthrough. The sad thing is, my shelves are full of titles that have one day hanging over them. This video is not about these forgotten titles, it's not about dusting off classics, although to gather this footage I did indeed have to dust off ones that I removed from the shelf, but today we'll take a look at the mainline numbered titles for each console. So I won't be looking at prologue or concept games, nor any of the other titles that you may want to point out to me. Nor will I be examining the sport title of the PlayStation 4, although its own graphical fidelity is definitely not in question, just not relevant for the comparisons here today, which is the aforementioned Trial Mountain. For me is Gran Turismo. Its tunnels, trees, banked curves and long quick straights that makes Gran Turismo feel like Gran Turismo. As the versions and generations advance, the details on the track consequently advanced also. So let's take a look at this iconic tunnel and foliage hill section. Obviously, Gran Turismo, the original, gives us our first experience with iconic tunnel. Texture-based banks of white light sit across the top of each wall with texture effects giving the concept that the light is shining down onto the concrete walls of the tunnel itself. Gran Turismo 2 shows that this tunnel has not had any further graphic work made to it. The same white lights are textured onto the walls. In this side by side you can see that effectively this is the exact same tunnel, albeit from two distinctly different positions. Gran Turismo 3 changed it all. The power of the PlayStation 2, a massive leap in processing ability from the original PlayStation, provided the ability and need to completely remake this track. As such, a completely new tunnel seems to have been driven through this hillside. The walls are now cobbled stone and brick, with less lights visible along the roof line. The same light casting texture technique does seem to have been applied, with bands of colour emulating the casting of the light from these roof lights, except now they've been further refined, with a cone of light replicated wider towards the top of the light and falling to a narrow projection of brightness as the light is cast down the tunnel wall. Equally, now we see that the light painted onto the road surface, with the light seemingly lighting up the road itself in bands. Gran Turismo 4 seems to have been completely reworked once again. There are now less lights adorning the wall, the light from which, as with Gran Turismo 3, still bands down the walls and across the road, but now shows the walls to have been returned to their original concrete. Perhaps construction wasn't completed in Gran Turismo 3, and the workmen were later allowed back in to finish off this tunnel. Overall, in this side-by-side, the tunnel seems very similar, but with one interesting change. The tunnel is now completely flat from beginning to end, whereas in Gran Turismo 3, there is a beginning of the hill evident towards the tunnel's end. This is an intriguing change. Stepping away for a moment from home console releases, let's take a look at the PSP release. This is a very similar tunnel to that found in Gran Turismo 4. Could this indeed be the reason for the completely flat tunnel? Comparing all these three versions, we can see that the PSP release seems to have much more in common with Gran Turismo 4 than that of Gran Turismo 3. Lighting, texture effects and geometry seem to mirror each other across the latter two titles, a clear break from the extra details handed out in Gran Turismo 3. And now we reach the HD era of PlayStation with Gran Turismo 5. The lights seem to have been replaced with physical objects rather than a simple flat texture, with the light on the left of the image showing distinct geometry to its form. Lighting has also seemingly reverted to its original yellow tint, but much more so than was ever seen in the original titles. The tunnel itself is again plain concrete, but interestingly, The road now seems to have once again gained its tail end slope, geometrically reverting to a higher poly version as that seen in Gran Turismo 3. Gran Turismo 6 is our final version for this video. As these quick changes of side-by-side show, not much, if anything, seems to have changed from Gran Turismo 5 to Gran Turismo 6. Lighting now shows more of a natural bloom around the light source, with the lights themselves seeming to emit a brighter yellow, which now casts a harsher yellow onto the walls than previously, but otherwise, this is the exact same tunnel. So let's take a look at what happens when you appear from out of this tunnel and into the open world canopied by those wonderful trees. Both Gran Turismo 1 and 2, as expected, have relatively, for their time, detailed canopies. Green with foliage showing a slit of sky between. Functional, and yet very pretty for the technology of the day. It's not until the PlayStation 2 and Gran Turismo 3 that we see a dramatic change to this section. As with the tunnel, the hill seems to have been completely reconstructed for a more advanced technology that was on offer. Shafts of light stream through the treetops. Many of the levels of foliage are now evident, with shadows and light shining down onto the road as we race away from the tunnel to the brow of the hill. Gran Turismo 4 shows much the same level of detail, except now it is much softer. Light rays are arguably still present, but no longer as evident. The shadowing effect remains upon the road, and the roadside textures remain similarly intact, but it lacks something of that impact that Gran Turismo 3's canopies had. Less evident light shafts. The overall softer filters remove something of the feel and realism that Gran Turismo 3 had, and what drove me to buy it. So again, now let's look at the PSP version. This time, unlike with the tunnel, there is no exact correlation with any previous version. The treetops are much more concentrated. Lack of any visible sky gives this version a feeling of almost like an extended tunnel. Yet the lighting and shadowing on the floor remains, hinting that there is a gap in the trees that we just can't see. PlayStation 3 and Gran Turismo 5. What a difference a generation makes. Now we see motion blur that makes detail observation a little more difficult. But the treetops now once again have been pruned back to show the sky between. Light now floods down onto the road's surface. Much more light than we have ever seen before. In fact, it appears that there is too much light for what we're able to see from the trees. But the shadows cast by these trees onto the roads are clean, detailed, and with plenty of visible foliage shadowing. Very nice aesthetic to this hill climb. But what happened to Gran Turismo 6? Is this indeed the same spot? Admittedly, motion blur now seems to have been dialed up right to 11. The same amount of light and coverage seems to be evident through all that blur, but now the shadows are nothing more than dark clumps, splodges of shadowing across the floor. Motion blur alone is not the cause of this difference. Shadow detail has definitely been dialed down, while corresponding detail seems to have remained of that of GT5. Looking at these two sections against each other, the differences are obvious. Trackside details seem, as far as can be seen through this excessive blur, to be of equal level. But the shadowing makes the trees above and the shadows they seemingly cast below seem to be somewhat disconnected. Before we close up this analysis, let's see these sections in motion. Static shots might give us something to examine, but that's not exactly how we see them when we play. So Gran Turismo has indeed evolved, and with it Trial Mountain has evolved equally. I had written this closing section stating that 2021 was hailed as the release of Gran Turismo 7, with an admission of doubt that due to Gran Turismo's history, that this was still personally in serious doubt. Seems that I was correct in my lack of confidence with this, with a Sony statement being released stating, Gran Turismo has been impacted by the COVID-related production challenges and therefore will shift from 2021 to 2022. With the ongoing pandemic, it's a dynamic and changing situation, and some critical aspects of game production have been slowed over the past several months. We'll share more specifics on GT7's release date when available. But whenever we do finally see Gran Turismo 7's release, return to the numbered titles, promises a return to the wonderful Trial Mountain. I personally can't wait to take a new look at this iconic track. Whenever Gran Turismo 7 is released, it will undoubtedly be a landmark title. Although it is doubtful that we will see a fully ray-traced game. Such computing is very demanding and not cost-effective for programmers' use of the hardware. That said, I do expect some ray-trace features, such as ray-trace reflections on the cars, even if I do actually expect them to be dramatically lower resolution than the rest of the scene. I also expect some degree of ray-trace lighting effects. We could possibly see the shadows from the tree-lined hill straight to show more realistic road shadows using this technique. But as with all these new technologies, integration into software is not free in terms of processing power. As much as these technological features will be, I'm sure, being pushed for inclusion by Sony, any higher level inclusion might only be possible, especially if Polyphony are aiming for 60 frames per second, with either a reduced resolution or reduced feature details, therefore lower resolution reflections and lower detailed shadows. This shadow detail may in fact make the new game's shadows resemble those of Gran Turismo 6 much more than they do that of Gran Turismo 5, but we'll see. So what will we see? What changes will there be in Trial Mountain? Do you think we will see clumpy splodgy shadows as we ascend the hill? Will we see a return to the tunnel textures of Gran Turismo 3, or will there still be concrete walls? Do you think the lighting in the tunnel will now be true real-time light sources, or they remain static baked textures and baked lights? Let me know in the comments below. And that's it. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe. See you later.